Good afternoon, everyone. It's Rebecca from the National Retail Association again. We have got Kyle Swain here from Lpc Cresa. We'll just wait a minute or so while all of our attendees come through, and then Kyle will get started.
Thanks, Beck.
I'll also take this opportunity just for everyone who's here. The National Retail Association is conducting a survey on the impacts of COVID-19 on your business. We do need this information to be able to advocate for your outcomes to government. So I'll be putting that link in the chat, and if everyone could perhaps take 10 or so minutes to fill that out, it'll allow us to get better outcomes. Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, Beck, and welcome back everyone that's been here the last couple of weeks and anybody new this week. Same format as last week, and I have set aside up to 30 minutes if you want to wait around through the question and answer period this week. Some great value in that last week, and I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, so trying to make as much time as possible during the Q&A to get to the questions. If you want to type those through to Beck during the first part of the presentation, we'll try to cover as much of those off as possible at the end. If we just go to the overview, Beck, I think last week I indicated what we'd try to cover this week, barring any significant changes during the week. And I think the major questions that I've received and we've handled at Lpc Cresa over the past week have been around defining the difference between the waived and the deferred rent component of the Code of Conduct, and also the part that keeps popping up in there about the reasonable recovery period after COVID-19. So I want to cover those two concepts quite quickly for you. I think this week is absolutely the period where we need to be communicating with landlords and locking in some agreements. At Lpc Cresa, we are certainly of the opinion now that the Code of Conduct is in place and to come to the party and to abide by the agreed principles within the Code of Conduct, and not to wait until it becomes legislated across each state and territory, which it's in the process of doing. We understand that there won't be any significant changes or any changes to the Code of Conduct as it becomes legislation, and each state and territory will pull out components or all of the code as it's currently written and legislate that. So what we have in the Code of Conduct is pretty much essentially the final product. Now, the key components of that is it says that the landlord should provide relief to the tenant in equal proportion to the impact of the Corona-19 period, and that at least 50% of that relief is to be provided as waived rent and no more than 50% as deferred rent. This was one of the questions at the end of last week. I tried to convey that message, but I want to be clear, at least 50% as waived rent. Waived means you will not ever repay it. And we've actually had this clarified by the government in respect to waived, and it means never repaid, not during the lease term, not after the lease term, and actually not even if you default on the lease. It cannot be recouped by the landlord once it's been waived. The deferred component, however, and I refer to deferred rent as deferred paying. If you come out of COVID-19 and are lucky enough to still be able to open your doors and recommence trade, and hopefully customers are back, paying your full rent, which you know in most cases has been quite difficult over the last year, 2 years or 3 years, it's only going to be harder when you're repaying your full rent plus a deferred rent component. So at Lpc Cresa with our clients, our conversation with landlords is most definitely around waived rent. And the leverage that we're using there is that any deferred rent can very likely result in failure of the business once it recommences trade and tries to pay back that deferred amount of rent, even if it is spread over the remainder of the lease term. So when you're discussing with landlords, or you work with tenant reps like Lpc Cresa, the objective has to be to achieve as much of your rent relief as waived rent as possible. We want to steer well clear of deferred rent and deferred paying. Now, the other concept was the reasonable recovery period. So the COVID-19 period is defined as commencing on April the 3rd, which was the date that the government started the job seeker program, or this component of it. And it will end when the government ceases the job seeker and job keeper payments to employees of companies. When the government makes that announcement, on whatever grounds that they feel it's right to make that announcement, that will be the end of the COVID-19 period. And thereafter, you enter into a reasonable recovery period. That's understood because we don't expect suddenly your turnover to return to pre-COVID-19 levels. You're not instantly going to revert back to what you were turning over per month prior to that period. And there's got to be a recovery period, and there has to be some negotiation with the landlords on what rent you pay during that period. Again, representing our clients, we're pushing for turnover rents where that's appropriate. And in some cases, that may not be the best option. One of our clients yesterday indicated that turnover rent is actually not the best option, and a percent abatement is the best way to go, and that's how we went. So they're the two key concepts I wanted to convey this week. And what we're going to look at next week is that last point. And if you just go to the next slide, Beck, we'll cover off next week, barring any major announcements or changes in the situation over the next week. We'll cover off what the post-COVID-19 trading conditions are going to look like, what market rents might do for lease renewals and new leases, and what sales and turnover is likely to be compared to pre-COVID-19. We want to try to prepare as best as possible for the post-COVID-19 period and the full lease cycle beyond that, and then looking at the next lease cycle to position retailers in the best possible position for that period and to thrive in that post-COVID-19 era. So on that basis, hopefully that gives you some understanding of what conversations you need to be having this week, or perhaps influences you a little bit in terms of wanting to seek some specialist assistance to cover those aspects with a landlord. You can certainly go to our website and get more information around this, or contact us at Lpc Cresa for more detail. We might go straight to Q&A if you've got some questions there, Beck.
Fantastic. So yes, we've got one question so far. So everyone, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A panel. We're here to help you. So please, use this opportunity now. Kyle, our first question: is JobKeeper a prerequisite to rent relief? Reason I ask is because the landlord sees this as a cost saving on payroll cost, which is really not the case. Then there's a second part. Also, my shop is in the middle of sale process, which is now on hold due to COVID. But obviously the new owner is not likely to be eligible for JobKeeper and in turn rent relief if a prerequisite.
Okay, two quite challenging concepts. So the first component was that the landlord sees that as a savings on operating costs, which has nothing to do with rent and has nothing to do with the code of conduct, mandatory code of conduct, and the processes around that. So my suggestion is we would certainly ensure that you are enrolled and registered on the ATO website for the JobKeeper program. You can register without finalising that, without providing your BAS statements or anything to prove eligibility. But you need to register and advise your landlord that you believe you are eligible under that program and therefore covered by the Code of Conduct, and as such the landlord is compelled to enter into good faith conversations, negotiations with you in order to provide rent relief in equal proportion to the impact on your business from COVID-19. So that's the process that I would follow. Your savings in terms of operating costs have nothing to do with that. And certainly most landlords would want to see that you've done everything possible to access the government initiatives, the government support processes, and manage your operating costs before you seek assistance from the landlord. So in my view, and my conversations with landlords would certainly be offering that sort of information up front to provide assurance to the landlord that you're already doing everything possible to secure your business's future, and now you need the help of the landlord and utilising the mandatory code to seek that help. The second component, Beck, I can't quite recall, but it had to do with the sale of the business and that the potential assignee of the lease may not be eligible as yet. So there's grey area around that. Might need to have a look into that outside of this webinar, and I'm happy to send an email to that person and look into the impact of that and what advice we'd give a client in that respect.
Certainly. So question asker, if you'd like to send through an email just to clarify, we can help figure that out after the webinar. Next, we've got a question from Troy. Which elements of the code are mandatory, which are optional?
It's all mandatory. So the code as it's written has, I think, nine points that are the mandatory code. The rest of the document is around guiding principles and the principles upon which it's based. But the entire code is mandatory. So I'm not sure if you have a particular item that you've been told by a landlord is not mandatory, or where that comes from, Troy. I'd have to understand some context to that question to answer more specifically, but the mandatory code of conduct is mandatory.
Thanks, Kyle. Next up, we've got Susan asking if we'll have a draft letter for retailers to send to shopping centre management.
I'm not sure if they're referring to the NRA or Lpc Cresa. We certainly have documents that we use for our clients to represent them in our discussions with landlords. But it's such a fluid situation, and every case is quite different. So it's very difficult to have a set template that can be offered to a broader market. So I would say not exactly, although at Lpc Cresa we certainly have templates that suit a wide range of situations, and then we tailor those to each specific tenant and client.
Thanks for that. We've got Victoria asking, how do we separate out income from online sales? Until now, it hasn't been an issue.
Yeah, good point. And what you're getting at is the definition of gross sales and decline in gross sales from your shop. So it's a little different in every state, the legislation around the definition of gross sales. Essentially, if those online sales are being collected from the store, or if they're being picked and packed to be sent to customers from your store, they have to be included as a part of your store's gross sales. And that's essentially the case accepted nationally. If, however, those online sales are being delivered to the customer from a warehouse outside of the store, or not being generated from the store itself, then you can exclude it. And most retail point of sale software, merchandise software, can exclude those sales. So I guess it just depends on your exact situation. And again, if you want to send through an email after this with some specifics, we'd be happy to advise you on your exact obligations in that respect.
Wonderful. This one's probably good for you, Kyle. Teresa asks, what costs are incurred if I get Lpc Cresa to negotiate on my behalf?
It's the best investment you'll ever make. Look, we would consider an investment. Generally, we are a financial advisory service, so there is a fee structure around different types of tasks and scope of works that we undertake in order to achieve outcomes for our clients. I've actually never had a client complain about us saving them money, so that's a good thing. But every situation is different, and we devise a scope of works around the required outcomes and what we need to do to achieve those outcomes, and we provide a specific fee schedule for that situation. In some cases, and another participant on the first week's webinar has engaged us to assist them on an hourly basis, and that's an investment of so far less than $1,000, which hopefully will return significant benefit to that tenant. In other cases, scope of works to achieve outcomes with a landlord, you may budget 1 month's gross rent, for example, as a guide, and that's pretty standard across commercial tenant representation or commercial agency representation for the landlord as well. Hopefully that gives you some indication without being too specific, because every case is different. I will say that all the members on this webinar and members of the NRA are afforded discounted rates through Lpc Cresa. So we guarantee that the rates that we offer any NRA members that come through the NRA inquiry line, the fee schedule will be adjusted to reflect at least 10 up to 20% discount.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Kyle. So we've got one from Penny. I hear a lot of retailers are refusing to sign NDAs sent out by the larger centres. What are the pros and cons of signing?
Signing NDAs around agreements, I presume. Look, by and large, every negotiation we have with a landlord is a confidential negotiation. And essentially the agreement that you end up signing has an NDA clause included within it. Landlords certainly don't want tenants advising other tenants what they've achieved, and that's understandable. So it's certainly something that we're completely comfortable with. Our negotiations with landlords are confidential. We don't share that information with other tenants specifically. And you know, we rely on that integrity with landlords in order to get the best results we can for our clients. In saying that, in this specific situation, in COVID-19, landlords have actually gone to the ACCC and gotten approval to communicate with each other around what rent relief they're providing to tenants. And that is a significant departure of that confidentiality agreement. In that situation, if the landlord is not remaining confidential about the agreement, then I would be reluctant to sign a non-disclosure agreement with that landlord. So,
Lovely. So from Katrina, when are we likely to see rent relief implemented? My landlord still refuses to negotiate, full stop.
No, look, that's a question that's worth asking, because landlords should be providing rent relief now, and they should certainly be at the negotiating table now. The compulsory and mandatory code of conduct is in place right now, so they are compelled to act in good faith and negotiate in good faith. And as Scott Morrison said a number of times, code of conduct. We haven't had to test that as yet, because when it's been explained properly to landlords, then they've certainly interacted with us and our engaged with us on behalf of our clients so far. But they do need to understand that code of conduct is in place right now, and if you can provide information showing that you're eligible under that JobKeeper program, your turnover is under $50 million, you are covered and protected by the code of conduct, then the landlord does need to come to the table now and start those conversations. When it's actually paid, that will be based on the negotiation and the agreement that's entered into, because in many cases we'll be presenting information around potential loss, not actual loss. April hasn't happened yet, but we're going to be showing impact of COVID-19 based on 1 week of March and the first couple of weeks of April, and extrapolating out to potentially agree for the next 3 months. So some of it may be retrospectively, but if it's a financial issue, then certainly plenty of tenants have been withholding some rent or all rent. It's not our advice to put yourself in a position that makes it difficult to negotiate with the landlord, but we understand many retailers just simply don't have the funds based on a disastrous March to pay April rent in advance. So if you, and I've said before, the rent is better, that money is better in your pocket right now than the landlord's, and it can be washed up in the final agreement as to whether it's repaid or not.
Okay, lovely. We've got a question. The government has mentioned about a mediating authority if negotiations fail. Do we know who this will be?
Yeah, it's a little grey. It's one of the grey areas in that document. There's some communication right now between the peak bodies and the government on that exact clarification. So we might have to just hold tight on that. But if you do need to go to mediation to get a result, then it might be worth contacting us, and we'll pursue that through the NRA as to so the body that's going to oversee the code of conduct is still being established, and whether the mediation falls with that group or the state and territory tribunals like QCAT, NCAT, and so on, then it's a little unclear just at the moment, but there will be a mediation in place.
Lovely. So we've gone about 10 minutes over time, so we'll just go one final question. This is from Rob. Sure. How far forward should we look for our rent abatement agreements since the COVID-19 period is not yet known?
Yeah, I think I mentioned last week as well, whatever agreement we put in place for our clients, we make sure that it's very clear that it can and should be adjusted for more relief, or to relax the relief if the situation changes dramatically. If stage 4 lockdowns come into place nationally, then we would expect to increase rent relief from, say, the agreed 25 or 50% to 100%. If on the other hand, the COVID-19 period is announced as being over and normal trade can recommence, then that may impact on what relief had been offered for that period, presuming ongoing impact. So it needs to be, the agreement, whatever is agreed, needs to be flexible enough to revisit and to update as we go along. We initially thought 3 months, and all the talk in the past week has been about a 6-month lockdown or social distancing measures for 6 months. So there is some concern that this will go on longer, and it's just really important to have agreements in place that are flexible and can be revisited and specific to the end impact.
Okay, great. Kyle, thank you again very much, and we look forward to seeing you again same time next week for everything that you see on the screen now, what to expect post COVID-19. The link for next week's webinar is in the chat right now, everyone. So if you'd like to head on over and register, get in there nice and early. And thank you again, Kyle.
Yeah, look, also on our website, you can click on a little box on the homepage and receive COVID-19 updates every day with some great leasing information specific to commercial and retail leases and industrial. The NRA is putting out the news flashes every day, so keep up to date each day with all that information, and we'll certainly keep answering questions on a weekly basis. And any questions you've posed today that haven't been answered, I'll try to answer during the week specifically.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your time, everyone. We'll see you next week.